Yes. Ellen Czajkowski, Office of Legislative Counsel. We were discussing the broadly municipal planning. We were talking about the capability and development plan. We were talking about maps. And I think we ended that discussion about maps.
Without an action step.
Well, I think we ended it with, and Mike just luckily took some notes that were helpful. Goal is to provide consistency in the base maps that are used among the district commissions for reviewing projects. That's the goal that I see those maps having, and I think making sure the language is articulating that, and I'm not sure it's clear right now in the language if that's what it's articulating. So, to the extent that that satisfies the committee, maybe Ellen and I will work on that, or Ellen will work on it and help us out to find that.
The next, on page 17, the next change that's in your bill is amending 4348. So we're talking about regional planning commissions approving the plan. So we're adding language. Upon adoption, the Regional Planning Commission shall submit the plan or amendment to the Vermont Environmental Review Board, the VERB, established under 10 VSA Chapter 151, which shall approve the plan or amendment if it determines that the plan or amendment is consistent with the goals of 4302. The plan or amendment shall take effect on the issuance of such approval. The board shall issue its decision within 30 days after receiving the plan or amendment. So this is requiring VERB to review regional plans and approve them.
So I guess we decided for now to leave that in, but we're going to revisit that as our conversation around the board continues.
Yep. And then also we amend 2798. So now we're talking about the state designation program. So another power that you gave the VERB was a person aggrieved by a designation decision of the state board under one or more sections of 2793 through 2793F, and that's downtowns, village centers, growth centers, neighborhood centers. I'm missing one. The 5 designations. That decision is now appealable to the VERB. If the decision pertains to a designation of a growth center, the period for filing an appeal shall be told by the filing of a request for reconsideration under that section and shall commence to run in full on the state board's issuance of a decision on that request. So currently, there isn't an appeal process, but because because of this enhanced designation process, the stakes are maybe a little higher. So you gave power to the VERB to review for the appeals. I'm sorry, that was articulate.
That's good. Okay.
So that's what's covered in the review and report of the joint proposal.
Well, I think that, this depends on how we do it.
All right, so the next section is on page 18. this is a proposal that's in the joint proposal. It's related to the 30-day advance notice requirement for applications. There isn't anything currently in your bill about this, so.
This is the pre-application process
Yes.
that I think everyone agrees to, thinks it's a good idea.
Yep. Okay.
I mean, I don't think that means we need to read it, but for now it'll go in and we need to understand the details.
Roger that.
Okay. Next is the section on conditions related to forest-based enterprises. There isn't anything in your bill currently about this.
We spent some time on this committee. What are the thoughts out there?
You know, this industry I know is one that we're supporting. We're supporting because of our interest in maintaining working lands, including forests. We know that they're under significant concerns because of the changing climate and the impact on this industry. It still has in it, contained in here, the relevant subdivision 8.1, 5, and 8 here, so you can still raise issues relating to noise, traffic, and aesthetics. So I'm in support of including this in our bill.
Any further conversation?
Okay. Others?
What did Trevor say? What?
Say that again so people
Oh,
can hear
I was
it.
just saying I'm in support of keeping it in the bill pending further conversation.
So that'll go in the draft that she's gonna work on.
Yes.
Yeah, for the next iteration, I am too. I did have a question, we can deal with that in the next iteration, about the retail sales part. But yes, absolutely, I think it needs to stay in, and they need the deference of our further look at it, rather than dismissing it.
Still- Okay, we're good to go. We're leaving it in.
Yeah, I just brought
10
my coat in
minutes to
case I got
secret.
cold, in here in general.
I put my coat proximate, but it's not right here. My plan to get my coat. Okay, let's see how far we get in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Or until the bell tolls.
Look, I get my coat.
Page
No, sorry.
21. Page 21, this is a change related to the mitigation of primary agricultural soils for forest-based enterprises. There's nothing currently in your bill about this.
Representative Hill.
Was this one of them that there wasn't a clear consensus on? Is that why there's an alternative, or is that, was there an alternative?
There is an alternative, yeah.
Because they couldn't quite come to.
Oh,
Yes.
Is this one of those?
looks
Yeah,
like
it's-
yeah.
Yeah, see, it's alternative 1, alternative 2.
Alright.
Yeah.
Really?
Okay.
You mean A or B?
Yeah.
I support alternative 2. I think it's important that we have a ratio of 1-to-1 that can work for again, supporting our forest products industry with a 1-to-1. I think that reflects a significant savings for our forest products industry. And we do the same thing in Act 250 pertaining to industrial parks with a 1-to-1, so I'm a advocate for alternative 2. I think it's simpler, it's cleaner, and there's some substantial benefits.
Trevor.
Yeah, just a question for anyone who might be able to answer. Is there a current practice around this now? making a change to it?
Right now, it's multiples of a ratio, that they have to substantially offset the loss of ag soils.
So it's
If
2 to
they're
1 or 3 to
expanding,
1?
say so this is, alternative one brings that ratio to a 1-to-1.
It is higher now.
Right now, it's higher.
Right now, it's the same as other projects that impact ag soils. So the question is, do we wanna lower it for the forest products industry? And if so, which of these do we prefer?
Is
And
it the ratio
I'm
the
trying to
same?
figure out the difference between
The
one and
ratio
two.
is the same. I think alternative one, last year the commissioner presented us with a proposal, and I think alternative one, creates the opportunity for that.
And the reason why I favor 2/1 is I think it's simpler, you're not asking the Forest Parks and Recreation to create a whole new methodology about it. It's clear, it clarifies that language.
It would be good to know, before we make a final decision, what the ratio is now.
Yeah.
I'll find that out.
So,
Yeah,
Mitigation also.
you know, do we know what the commissioner's preference is here?
Billy might.
Billy Costa, Agency of Natural Resources. I think the reason there are two options for the committee in this section of the joint proposal is because there isn't agreement. The FPR commissioner's preference is for, I guess, option A, which envisions his department coming up with a new framework to deal with mitigation. I think the NRC's proposal is the one-to-one approach that Representative Dolan articulated. So I think they both work towards the same end, but the commissioner supports the one you presented to you earlier. That's his preference.
I like the two commissioners myself. I think he's the one's gonna be enforcing it, making the deal, kind of going forward with it, and I think he should be in a position to have that kind of flexibility for the trade that, since alternative two doesn't quite allow that. It's prescriptive.
Matt.
so the way I'm reading this is that mitigation and offsets for forest-based enterprises, number one, entitled to a ratio of 1 to 2 protected areas, and are allowed to mitigate. And so, so paying a mitigation fee.
Yeah.
So am I reading it correctly in saying that they have to have a 1-to-1 protected area and pay a fee? Versus the alternative 2, which is saying they just need to maintain an area, I'm not quite sure I understand.
I'm not sure I understand
There's an
alternative
and.
two.
Yeah.
So they have to do one.
So they have to do number
Two.
1 and number 2, but number
But
2 is
two.
broken into 2 parts.
Right.
And they can either pay a mitigation fee or,
I'll follow the method.
Well, cause the ratio would be 1-to-1, and that's how you would calculate, I think,
oh,
mitigation
then that's,
impacts.
okay. So that's-
You could pay or
Yeah.
follow an offset, but in terms of, the second alternative, mitigation of a conversion of primary ag soils by a forest-based enterprise permitted under this chapter shall be entitled to a ratio of 1-to-1 protected acres to acres of affected prime soil. What does that mean, protected acres? So they have to set aside protected acres of what? Of agricultural soils or of any
Protected from
land?
How do you read that?
Billy might have something.
She's got it, I'm sure.
Right now, it's, I found the ratio.
So that's the language that's currently in the statute. That's how that prime ag soil mitigation section reads. It talks about protected acres to impacted acres. So I think it's just providing inserting another section that's consistent with what's already in the law.
And so it's supporting our forest-based products by lowering the ratio.
Because right now the ratio if they're treating it like a housing development, it's the same sort of impact, and that ratio is either 2 to 1 or 3 to 1.
Holy.
I've been waiting for that.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? This is a building evacuation. Gather your belongings if they are within reach, and evacuate the building using the designated route for your area with the closest stairwell or exit. Assemble in for a designated area and check in with your fire and life safety
Us, it's that door there,
I agree with that.
whatever. We're supposed to get that door.
Going to the elevator.
Good, good.
Yeah.
So team, I think it's important that everyone know that our committee.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? This is a building evacuation. Gather your belongings if they are within
we have to
reach,
email
and
you when we get
evacuate
there?
the building using
I need to
the
know where you
designated
expect
route
to
for
make
your
that.
area with the
So we're
closest
gonna know
Today,
where
I
you're
did he go into the pavilion?
Said he's gonna do the elevator.
Karen Z.
Well, that's a really good question too, because I reported that he was doing his own. He has his own plan.
Alright. I know that he goes,
Newsflash, newsflash.
I know that he's supposed to go to
I
the,
think he was the big one.
I mean, they're terrible. Cause he has to use the elevator, so.
Which you shouldn't use in a fire drill, technically.
Alright, we're gonna
Right.
call our meeting back to order. Before the air quality drops, it already has, so down. Yeah.
Ellen Czajkowski, Office of Legislative Counsel, and I don't remember if we made a decision on Primax oils.
Oh, yeah, that's where we are.
That's what we were discussing.
I believe that I agree with Representative Dole, and I like alternative 2 for simplicity. And I would say that Carrie, you were looking at what the ratios now are required to be.
Yep. And right now, it's treated similar to a development, which has a 2 to 1 to 3 to 1 ratio,
2 to 1 or 3 to 1.
or 3 to 1.
Based
No
on-
more than, no less than 2 to 1, and no more than 3 to 1. And we have a similar language for industrial parks where we eased that offset of Primax soils, and that currently is at 1 to 1. So this is
Consistent.
consistent.
Okay, thank you. Others have thoughts or opinions on this?
So, what are we putting down for the ratio?
1 to 1 is the ratio.
Alright. Page 22, permit presumptions. So, your bill contains new language around permit presumptions and how they're used. So, the overall theme of yours is increasing the ability. Your bill does a couple of things related to permits and their use. So, first, a permit has to be part of a program that reliably meets its goals, such as achieving water quality standards. Also, a permit can be, a presumption can be rebutted by the introduction of evidence contrary to the presumed fact. So that is lowering the standard required to rebut a presumption. I'm on page 23, I'm reading now, sorry. Because we struck a bunch of language on 22.
Can we talk about the language that we did strike? Because I was just looking at that on 22. So, other permits and approvals, presumptions.
So I am pretty sure that all of that struck language is actually moved, not just struck.
Okay.
It's moved into what is the new sub 4.
Okay, so then,
I'm trying to remember. I think we had a discussion about sort of clarifying the difference between municipal permits and state permits, just so that those were separated out for clarity. But I'm.
Yep. I kind of dove into this section, if I may.
Great.
And I found a real positive improvement in the joint proposal, because what it did was separate state from local in sections, so you could find if you're pertaining to, say, the local permit section or municipal permit section, you could find it more easily. So I think there's some clarity there, and there's a lot of similar language because of that reorganization. For example, the under 1D1, similar language up to the applicant. In lieu of evidence was moved, is similar language. B was similar to R3B. C was similar to some of the strike all language, but it was found elsewhere. And it was, I think fundamentally it was a reorganization. The one change I do notice, and I just flagged that, maybe Ellen, you can maybe substantiate that, is the choice of the word shall or may. And whether you're dealing with the board, which board? Were there two question marks for me? For example, the choice shall was under D1A, and we had a board may be by rule, but we do use the shall later on related to C. C has the shall. Their C has our shall. So I felt it was provided some clarity by breaking it into those two sections.
And Billy, forgive me if you already did this, but the permits that have not gone through rule, that would be affected by this.
Yeah, and I apologize, Matt, that's something Matt has said he would get to you. I don't think he has yet. I actually just emailed him to remind him that you need that ASAP.
Okay.
So we'll do that.
That would be helpful.
And if I may add just one more thing, it does nothing for the municipal permits in terms of rebuttable presumptions. Is this the section where we talked about rebuttable presumptions, or that's a little later? That's later.
Yeah, I don't.
Assumptions. Assumptions.
No,
presumptions.
Yeah, 'cause there's
Yeah.
statements about it now.
I do support the rebuttable presumption language in here. We have it in there already to some extent, and this helps to clarify. Rebuttable presumptions presume that you're compliant, but you have the ability to contest that permit. It doesn't say it's, just to clarify what the term rebuttable presumption means. It doesn't eliminate the right to contest something, it just gives you the deference that the permit achieved is compliant with state law.
So question,
Yeah.
where it says, in these instances, where it says presumption, do they mean rebuttable presumption?
Can you? Where are you?
So in under state and local permits, state permits, early the second line of underlined language. In lieu of evidence by the applicant, the presumption established by this subdivision shall only apply to the issues. Because I don't think
Yes.
that means rebuttable presumption established, but maybe it does. And they don't say that. What does that mean? Is it rebuttable presumption, or is it just,
Yes,
it is?
yes.
Even though it doesn't say it.
Yes, we're approaching the edge of my knowledge on the exact way that they're used, but often when you apply for your Act 250 permit, under specific criteria, you may use a permit that you have received either from the A&R
Yep.
or someone else as evidence that you are complying.
Okay.
And it establishes a presumption that you are complying with the criteria. That presumption is rebuttable.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you.
Your language in your bill lowers the amount of evidence needed to rebut that presumption. The joint proposal does not affect the strength of the presumption, but yours is changing it so that introduction of evidence to the contrary will rebut the presumption, and currently it is different than that. It's a higher standard, and I am trying to find it.
And theirs keeps it the way it is now.
Yes. And also extends the presumption to a number of permits that are not currently given the presumption.
But I wonder functionally if they end up kind of getting presumption anyway. Like, I'm not sure what does rulemaking do when the sort of clearance that you guys have put in here for permits that exist but haven't gone through the rulemaking at the NRB level. Can you help me understand what happens when the NRB reviews a rule?
Sure. And this may, my understanding is that when the presumption is currently established through rule, an applicant simply needs to provide the permit to demonstrate they've complied with the criteria. If that presumption has not been created, they still need to provide substantive testimony to that criteria. They can say, I have this permit, but then they still have to kind of make an argument in addition to that. I think that is part of the dynamic. But once the presumption has been clearly established, then they can rely on that permit. But I can talk to our land use attorney and get back to you on that.
Carrie? Thanks, Billy.
Yeah, and the reason why I support it is particularly it provides continuity, consistency. Remember the Act 250 came before we had Clean Water Act jurisdiction from EPA over the Federal Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. And so this actually saves time and effort on the part of the conservation, the district commissions, because they can rely on how a state permit can meet the relevant criteria under Act 250. And remember that those state permits have to still comply with whatever that authorization covers. And that typically ties back to federal law, Federal Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Air Act, for example. And the state statutes that reflect states' jurisdiction over oversight for those laws. So and they can be rebutted through the appeals process currently in a state permit. So in my opinion, I think this provides the kind of continuity and predictability that and clarity what the law, and how we would treat permits in the Act 250 setting. And so I see that the joint proposal makes sense.
have a thought on that, Ellen?
I didn't finish reading the list, but because one of the last things that you also include is there's no presumption for a permit authorizing discharge of a pollutant into a water if that water is already impaired. So we did have a lot of testimony last year about the concerns about water pollution and whether you were concerned about if A&R issuing further permits for waters that are impaired, whether or not that was a good idea. So.
And also, in ours, I'm seeing it says, on page 23, number 2, presumption created under this subsection may be rebutted by the introduction of evidence contrary to presumed fact. That's during the first district commission review. And the others are, I think, is the rebuttable presumption generally exercised at appeal level, or it's at what you could have it at either?
I think it happens at either.
Either, yeah.
Where's that language you talked about clean water and discharge?
That's under, it's on page 23 under, A, 3A. In the middle of the page.
Can I speak to that provision? When we have waters impaired by a pollutant, the state is already obliged under the Federal Clean Water Act to determine the source of those problems, put a plan together, and restore those waters. That's called a TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load, Section 303D of the Federal Clean Water Act. And the state is already obliged not to issue permits if it's going to cause or contribute to a further impairment of that water related to that pollutant. And to have it here, but you still have discharges into receiving water. Let's take a wastewater treatment plant, for example. The TMDL doesn't go to zero discharge of, say it's going into Lake Champlain and the waters are impaired with phosphorus. That discharge is never going to be zero, but we're still going to be operating that discharge. We'll be putting in technologies to drive down those discharges so that that whole sector, including that plant, will be below its permitted portion of what would be allowed in order to drive that water body to attainment, to meet our water quality standards. I say this because that's an example, and I think that we would be creating, with one small paragraph, a duplication of effort of what's already obliged under the state when they're implementing TMDLs. And to put this in here, I think is not, I don't think is necessary or even wise.
It's just redundant. Redundant.
It's
The only-
redundant.
Do you have something? The only thing that I'm thinking about is that Act 250 is a place where everything is considered together holistically. And one of the challenges with the A&R permitting process is it's siloed and separate. And the Act 250 process brings things together and says, overall, is this a benefit? Do the benefits outweigh the costs of this development? And I want to be sure as we look at this section that we're thinking about that and how permits for different resources interact with one another to add up to something that individual agencies or departments, divisions are not considering. So,
Well, may I respond to that? You may recall the Lowe's decision, which went all the way up through our court system, when there was a development to create a Lowe's in South Burlington, I believe, on a waters that would drain into Lake Champlain, and it was denied on the stormwater permit side, the state permit, because and it had to be litigated. But that created such precedent that resulted in a stormwater program that has various permits to ensure that we're not causing a contributing impairment. Now that discharge is like, you can't increase discharge of that pollutant of concern. And that's not in the Act 250, again, that's within the realm of the stormwater permitting program. And through the TMDL process that even cranks down on that, the discharge of the pollutant. You're right that Act 250 does consider holistically the project, but keep in mind, it still has itemized criteria, and through that itemized criteria has associated associated permits, state permits that through this rebuttable presumption would be used to reflect compliance to those criteria. So I still think that it's not necessary. And I favor
Representative
that.
Cullen.
For me, I think what this, the no presumption for a permit, we're still talking about A here of 3, doesn't mean that it's not gonna be looked at, because someone can rebut it, the commission can rebut it. For me, I think it means that just because because they have a permit from A&R doesn't mean that there will not be any additional pollutant discharged in impaired water. And I think what you actually just said is, well, there will be some in many instances. And so it's that some that discovery through a rebuttal, if it had to be a rebuttal, would be found. But in this case, there is no presumption. And so then there will be a discovery of, well, then, okay, how much phosphorus is coming out of Lowe's, even under best practices, for instance. And yep, the agency gave them a permit because they used best practices, but what did that mean? How many? And so I think that keeps that discussion going. I don't think it keeps Lowe's from building, for instance.
They still built, but they went to net
Well,
zero discharge of phosphorus.
Well, we're using that only as an example of, how about Farmer Jim then instead of Lowe's?
Farmer Jim is not in
It, yeah, he is right now in your imagination.
He's not farming, he's got a very successful business
It's
that's
got
not
a very
a farm.
successful ski area that's making
So
tons and
it
tons of
might-
money, discharging pollutants as we speak.
The point is, it keeps the discussion going instead of just saying A&R said, so it's okay, and it is rebuttable, but at your nickel. And so I just think it keeps it going. Now, I'm not saying this is the sole reason why, or the reason why we should choose our version over the joint proposal. This could, I think, be another merge, where this part could be brought into the joint proposal part. But I think we may need to move off of this and just choose one or the other and move forward.
Well, if I just made one more comment, if I may. What this could potentially do is could drive that development away from a urbanized area to a green field. Because you won't have an impaired water in a green field. You might as well put that development in a potentially, open area, open field, cornfield, and
I thought you just said it didn't do anything and it was redundant.
no, but if you include it, what I'm saying, if you're including this in here, I'm just arguing another reason why, if someone was interested in a redevelopment project in a impaired water, they have, the cost to implement projects to drive down the discharge is substantial, and they're going to have to do it. The compliant, right now, we're facing the 3-acre permit process, all part of Act 64. That's a substantial price tag to deal with it, and we should embrace that, accept that, support it, and, because those types of projects did not have stormwater controls in them, and, were under treating their stormwater runoff, if treating at all. And so, we need to, in my mind, know and support the state laws that we have in place that are, in fact, are designed to meet our state water quality standards. And they're important. And what I'm saying is that I see the redundancy of this where it's not necessary, and we always have to be concerned that our public policy decisions aren't driving development to areas that are undeveloped intentionally to avoid the costs associated with managing their stormwater.
So not only is it redundant, you could have a negative effect.
Yep.
Okay.
I think that's a good point. So which one?
So I again support the joint proposal.
That was your best argument. I thought that was the best argument.
Of the afternoon?
That it might make somebody go to a beautiful unwrecked up area when they could be in a place that's already a little compromised. That was a good argument. I'm not kidding, I'm saying I really think that's good reasoning, so I'm okay with it.
I doubt they're gonna move to Huntington, if they needed to be in Burlington, but at any rate, I would support the state one, the states one, the joint effort, for the sake of moving this forward, and if there's a way that we can make it better by pulling some of ours in, once we get that in discussion, I'd be in favor of that as well. But, you are very persuasive,
Very persistent,
That's our one issue.
All right, any other thoughts on this?
I'll just support that approach.
Okay. All right.
So, well, so to recap, what exactly do you like from either proposal? Because they're doing different things. So yours is lowering the bar to rebut a presumption, as well as the other things related to water. So no presumption for the water, and so theirs is saying that all permits don't have to go through the rulemaking process to be added to the list of presumptions. They're not changing the bar. So you could do those two things simultaneously. You could lower the bar and say all of the A&R permits have the presumption and there is the lower bar. Is that the sort of joint merging you were talking about?
that is what I was talking about, yes, thank you.
Okay. Is that what anyone else was talking about? Yes? No?
I'm not sure. I think I need
Okay.
to understand more
It
about
would be
what
like
permits
lowering
we're
the bar.
talking about. Skipping the rulemaking part of the review of them. And I need to, actually, can you explain again the lowering of the bar?
Yeah, I don't know what you'd like, what that means.
So under 2, so above 3, 2, a presumption created under this section may be rebutted by the introduction of evidence contrary to the presumed fact. So that's different than the bar currently, which requires affirmative testimony that the criterion has not been met. So at least the goal of that language was to lower the bar to rebut the presumption.
So, but if someone were to introduce evidence contrary to the presumed fact under the current standard, it seems to me it would have to be considered by the commission. I mean,
I think perhaps I need to do more research on this,
Okay.
Because it is a legal standard that isn't expressed already in the statute. It's in case law primarily.
okay, so I would like for you to do that and help us understand a little bit more the nuance of that before we even spend the paper of making the change. Personally, I need to understand it better. I'm open to the joint proposal, but I wanna understand them both. And the two nuggets that we just talked about. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other sections we've already done? Every time I turn the page, it's
We have.
I know.
We talked about interstate interchanges, and we talked about, I think we did,
Yep.
and burden of proof, so I think we only have master plans and exemptions in downtowns left,
Okay.
I think.
Okay, good. Good, well, then we have, I think, two
But I
pages on the
think-
other one.
No, we did talk about the interchanges.
We didn't do burden.
Oh, okay, but they're almost identical, the burden of proof.
Good, okay. Sorry, I
Um,
digressed. Let's keep going.
And also, so, we can get to master plans in a second, but I think we punted on exemption in downtown, in hoping there would be testimony from ACCD about the differences in areas we're talking about.
Oh, yeah, the maps. Did you guys send those in, Billy?
That-
Matt
Matt
did.
said,
Okay, good.
so under Matt Chapman, it should
I
be
believe so.
maps. I think someone sent them, and it was Matt, or was it Chris?
It was under Matt's name.
Okay, so we have that, we should look at that. But, so let's keep going, master
Okay.
plans and then.
Okay. So then on page 24, we have a proposal related to the fees for master plans. Your bill currently does not contain anything related to this, and so the joint proposal, I'm gonna read. So, for projects involving the review of a master plan, the fee established in subdivision 1, which is the general fee for permits, shall be due for any portion of the proposed project for which construction approval is sought, and a fee equivalent to 10 cents per $1,000 of total estimated construction costs in current dollars shall be due for all other portions of the proposed project. If construction approval is sought for future permit applications, the fee established in 1, the general permit fee, shall be due, except to the extent that it is waived pursuant to subsection F.
Great lawyer language. We're not blaming you,
Story of
That's
it.
Just
I didn't write
Evan,
it.
Evan Meenan, right there.
Evan drafted that,
I
really?
think so.
So, so there,
Proud of it.
currently, there is a master plan, and there's a whole you can apply for a master plan, which is, when you do construction in phases, and it's stating that you can the fee is due for the part that is proposing to be constructed immediately, like the first phase of construction. That fee is due. But it's not requiring fees for the rest of the permit, because it's also establishing a fee waiver system in the next section. So there is in existence a fee, you can apply for a fee waiver. I think this sort of broadens the types of when a fee can be waived. So when you apply for Act 250, your permit has a fee associated with it, and This is allowing for waiver of that fee.
And the concept is to incentivize master planning for industrial parks. You could already master plan for an industrial park, and it's a pretty handy tool. I guess this is to encourage it. Or master, I thought it was for industrial park, but maybe
So
it's.
it doesn't use industrial park anywhere. It's broadly being applied to all master plans.
So a ski area could apply for a waiver, anyone could apply
Yes.
for a waiver.
Yes.
So, keeping in mind that Act 250 is in the red right now with the fees.
I think in our experience for large, complex phased projects, if they're not planned well, those proceedings can take an exceptional amount of resources for all involved. And I think this is intended to incentivize doing good work up front, understanding that's may result in lesser fees, that it should be an overall savings on the enterprise, because there should be less work, it should be a better process. And I think the NRB and others determined that this was a case where, notwithstanding the budgetary pressures, it made sense to offer some incentive to do master planning. These don't happen very often, and when they do, we've seen real value in doing that planning work.
Committee, thoughts, comments?
I think, if I may, I think master planning is smart planning. It's like plan unit development at the local level. You bring in all the issues, you address it all at once, it's efficient, saves you money, saves the applicant money, the reviewer, money, and it results in a better project. So I think this is a good thing.
Does anyone, Jim?
So I will agree with all of that, but I'm just wanting to understand the language. What I think happens, the proposer of the subdivision pays the 10 cents per thousand of the total. He does it up front. But then, I'm not sure what the future permit applications are. I guess I would have thought that meant future parts of the master plan, but I don't really think that's what the combination of these two sentences say. But, so, I got from the chuckling when this was read that I wouldn't be the only one who didn't really understand this. And even if I am, Billy, could you explain it to me? Or let's start with Counsel.
I will try. So I do want to point out that this clause combines two sections of existing fee statute. So there's actually already a provision in 83A, that says for projects involving, where is it? For projects involving the review of master plan, fee equivalent of 10 cents per thousand of the total estimated construction. So that's already in statute. So this basically just combines it. That says, typically when people apply for master plan, they're applying for an initial construction phase at the same time.
Okay.
So they're saying,
phase 1 of 5.
Right, so we're gonna build phase 1.
Yep.
We want you to do the full-blown review of that now. And this says you pay the normal fee for that portion of the
For phase
project.
1.
Right.
Okay.
And that for all subsequent phases that are being reviewed as part of the master plan, you would pay that reduced.
When you try to pull that permit.
Yeah, you'd upfront pay that reduced amount. I think it's, no, whenever you would pull that permit, it would be at that reduced amount.
When you say that reduced amount,
Though 10 cents per thousand. No, I think it's at the time, and then there's a provision to either even further reduce fees when you actually construct if you've achieved all your findings through the master planning process.
So currently, you're saying master plans benefit from a reduced fee,
Yes,
and that's
currently,
the section we're in.
yeah,
And then it's clarifying the conditions under which the future fees might actually be waived.
correct. Yeah. And the idea there is that the board has discretion to waive those fees. And if you have gotten master planning, you can also seek partial findings. You could say, we only want a decision on 3 or 4 criteria, or you can have that process provide findings on the full suite of criteria. So the more that you've checked off in that master planning process, the more likelihood that you will have a waiver of the fee when you actually pull the construction permit.
Yep.
So that's the kind of framework that it tries to establish. I agree the language is hard to decipher out of context. And if you have follow-up questions, it might be good to have Evan or Greg kind of walk you through how this works, because they're really the pros on that.
So I'm hearing an interest in putting this in our bill and then getting walked through with Evan or Greg. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, cause I don't, in response to your question, Representative McCullough, I think maybe it should be permit amendment and not application, but I'm not actually certain.
Yeah.
Which may clarify slightly when they get their next phase. I think it might be an amendment, but I'm not
Okay.
sure. That might.
Okay,
So
yep.
right now it says application.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Yep.
Future permit application. That's our question. Great. Okay, moving on.
So 26 is the downtowns.
I have a quote in the left-hand column that someone said, "This is monumental."
I don't think it was me.
One of our committee members said it.
I think I used that word.
So currently in your bill, we have the concept of multi-tier jurisdiction as well as combined with exemption. So your multi-tier jurisdiction increases jurisdiction over critical resource areas and working lands areas, and then decreases jurisdiction in areas that receive enhanced designation. So we talked about critical resource areas, so any development in those areas currently triggers, under your bill would trigger Act 250 jurisdiction, and then you also created the concept of rural and working lands, which we potentially need to do more work on if you're going to pursue to more clearly define what those areas are. And then you exempt things that have received an enhanced designation. So to receive an enhanced designation, you have to be areas that can be given the enhanced designation are downtowns, village center, new town center, growth center. And they apply to the state board for that, and that decision can be appealed, and then development within those areas is exempt from Act 250.
So,
And then under the joint proposal, downtowns and neighborhood development areas are automatically exempt, and we repeal the section that establishes designated downtown findings, which is a process that currently exists where designated downtowns can go through an expedited process for Act 250, and if they've done that, they can receive exemption. And then They also establish in the joint proposal a process by which existing permits in downtowns and neighborhood development areas can be extinguished. And upon reflection, I have been thinking about this. Your bill also contains a provision that is not on this chart related to release from jurisdiction, which is slightly different than what they're talking about, but could be analogous. So under your provision in your current bill for release from jurisdiction, projects that no longer meet the Act 250 threshold but still have an Act 250 permit can apply to have their permit extinguished. So they're under the joint proposal that's similar. They're basically saying that any project in a downtown or neighborhood area that has an existing Act 250 permit can have their existing Act 250 permit extinguished, whereas yours sets up a process for any type of development that is no longer meeting the Act 250 threshold. So potentially, if you that provision could potentially relate, but it's not directly analogous. And you, because under yours you have to apply for it to the district commission, whereas this is automatically granted by the municipal panel after they've given their municipal permit.
So the ACCD review for the designated downtown, or the...
No, the zoning board or the planning commission. So if you see on the left side at the bottom of page 26, appropriate municipal panels, those are who are issuing municipal permits to developments within the designated downtown or designated neighborhood development area. So that's your zoning board of adjustment, your planning commission, or your zoning development review board, depending on the municipality. That's the entity that will be giving a municipal permit for development in one of these areas.
Billy.
Can I just clarify something? So under number 2 of that section, so
You're in the joint proposal?
yeah, under the joint proposal. So the concept of the joint proposal is that
Page 27.
yeah. So this doesn't allow the extinguishment of Act 250 permits necessarily. What it does is say that Act 250 permit conditions carry into the municipal permit. So Act 250 remains. If something is proposed to change at a jurisdictional property within a downtown or neighborhood development area, and it requires a municipal permit, that municipal permit replaces the Act 250 permit, and it carries in all existing Act 250 permit conditions unless they meet this list of criteria. And that unless would include permits that are no longer applicable because they apply to a construction phase that had already passed, or whether the municipal permit has comparable restrictions that were intended to be achieved through Act 250. So if there's a gap between the municipal bylaws and what the Act 250 permit had, those Act 250 permit conditions carry into the municipal permit. So it doesn't get extinguished, it just gets kind of cut and pasted into a different...
And the municipality would be responsible for
Correct.
enforcing them.
Correct.
So for example, your Act 250 has a criterion 9F, for example, I think it's 9F on energy efficiency. So would that carry into the municipal permit then?
Let me just read this.
Presumably that one would have been met in construction.
You know, the language, and again, this is like where probably Matt would be most helpful, but letter sub D says an issue, you know, it would carry into the permit unless an issue that is addressed by the municipal regulation and the project will meet that municipal standard. So if the town has comparable standards and the project will meet that town standard, then it has to hit that. If it doesn't, then the 250 condition carries in.
That's great.
So, this is a pretty critical piece because, when we were working with VNRC, they absolutely didn't want to lose meaningful protections that existed in Act 250 permits, and they felt that this was a good way to kind of bridge that transition. So if this is a piece that folks are interested in pursuing, I think, having maybe John and Matt walk you through it in a more detailed way could be helpful.
Okay. Representative Dave.
What happens if you had a A&R permit for a project that didn't go forward, but the A&R project is still on the land? I mean, the Act 250 project, the permit is still on the land. Does this allow that to disappear?
That does not, but the provision Ellen referred to in your bill was intended to do that. And I think that was frankly an oversight on our part not to include that. I don't think we have any issue with what the committee proposed there, so, you should feel free to put that back in.
So this, I'm sorry, I must have lost my, I checked out here. So you're talking about the release from jurisdiction that we haven't, and so it's actually not in this document because it's,
Yeah.
and we're gonna, I think, look at that list tomorrow. But yeah, I think we will look at the list of things that weren't addressed in the joint
All right.
proposal. That it would be very helpful to have one of you all here to help us, just like you just did.
Sure.
For that.
Yeah, I didn't see them as directly analogous, although an argument could be made that they're similar.
That's okay.
I would say that I think that the language in that joint proposal currently gives the municipality broad discretion to decide what conditions should remain, and it does use the word extinguish. So the Act 250 permit is ostensibly deleted, and they get to pick what, if any, conditions they are going to carry forward.
This is in the joint?
Yes.
Enforceability is, I think, to me, enforceability is the issue in that.
Totally wrong. Not to disagree, and I'll stop, but it does say the municipality shall include the Act 250 conditions unless it meets those criteria. So while there is some discretion certainly within those enumerated criteria, they have to bring in the 250 permit conditions unless they meet those standards. So it's maybe just a nuance.
Well, so for B, compliance with another state permit that has independent jurisdiction addresses the condition in the previously issued permit. So I'm not really sure what that looks like. I also don't know what C, state or federal law that is no longer in effect or applicable. So I'm not really sure how those would play out, and I think it could be more clear.
That's fair.
Billy's nodding, and Representative McCullough has a question.
Yeah, I'm nodding too on that account.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the what I think is the overriding attempt here. First of all, I think elsewhere we're exempting Act 250 in these districts, Act 250 jurisdiction in these districts. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yes. And so, be that the case,
The previous page elsewhere.
Yep.
In this section.
So that's
But
part of this,
Page 26.
yeah. Yep.
yep.
Okay.
So be that the case, then in these districts, there are already projects that have Act 250 permits.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me this is designed to say, well, these guys didn't need it and to build, and now you have an opportunity to extinguish yours. I mean, that's the way I've been looking at this. And if that's not the case, then we need to make that more clear, I think, somehow.
No, that is the exact intent.
Yeah?
But currently under Act 250, permits exist in perpetuity.
Well, yes, but this under these, in the new, in the new world, would get this out, if you will. But this, so, because I wanna make sure I understood that that really is what we're trying to do here. But in the process, I guess, make sure that the municipality picks up the management of those, if you will, or enforcement of them. Is that part of what's kind of being said here, or being said here?
Right, this is a policy decision. Your bill currently doesn't contain
Right.
anything like this specifically, so
Right.
you can definitely make the choice to pursue that if
Which-
you're interested in that, yeah.
Well, that is what the joint proposal says, though, is that
Yes.
accurate? Okay, good, yeah. Yeah.
So once a municipality achieves enhanced designation, am I correct in assuming that then that means it gets a pass on 250?
Under your bill,
Yes,
in the area that has been given just the area.
yes.
Yes.
And so consequently, once that pass has been given, the neighbor next door who has lived with a 250 permit, does that 250 permit stay with him? Because basically they're in the same kind of, they're in the same area, they're in the same neighborhood, they're in the same area that's been given the enhanced designation? Or is it by project by project? So is it always relative to?
If
What's
you have
there?
if you have a permit, an Act 250 permit, it exists in perpetuity, it lasts forever. If you are in an enhanced designation area, but you already have a permit, that doesn't change anything. You keep your permit. Projects moving forward, new project applications, they're exempt from Act 250, so,
Under ours, but
under yours.
we, I
Well,
think,
under ours, yes, but
Yeah.
not under there.
not under the.
Right,
joint.
the joint proposal does not have an enhanced designation, so it's an
Right.
automatic.
Right.
Yeah.
Now we're getting to it.
So,
No.
I love it as the day gets longer.
Sounds ill.
So, understanding our decision points here, seems to me that our proposal is pretty grounded in the critical resource areas concept and the enhanced designation concept, so sort of an important fork in the road here. Matt?
Just to be clear, so, the joint proposal, well, now I lost it. So, it's located in a downtown development district or neighborhood development area. And those are both very specific things, right, in the
Yeah.
ACCDs.
They are,
Yeah.
I'm actually kinda wondering,
I'm looking at it
can we
right
take a
now.
pause? I'm trying to look at it, but I can't, and I
Yeah, you
have
can
it up, I have the atlas up, the link that Matt sent us, but
You can zoom in wicked far.
you zoom in wicked far, but even still, I'm having a hard time. I thought Middlebury, for example, had a neighborhood development area, but I'm not seeing it, so I'm,
Doesn't have.
I just
There are
went
only
to,
6 neighborhood development areas.
I just went to the statute to find how they define it.
but I think it would help, I'm trying to get to a question team of having Billy or someone who knows how to use the atlas. I think it'd be helpful to have a visual and or a quantification, so there's 6 neighborhood development areas, but I don't know how big they are. And how many, there's 20 some odd downtowns, and I don't know how, we took testimony last year, pretty small area, I'm not thinking that's a crazy thing to do, but I just think understanding what we're talking about statewide is really important.
Just approved.
But so the different,
Blue is the neighborhood,
So-
you know that though, you don't.
the thing on the side,
think
the
it
on
was
off.
I couldn't,
I think you have to
I
zoom
can't
in.
make it work, right.
But so in
See
the
where
house,
they
in
are.
Sorry,
the house
Matt.
proposal,
I tried.
anything, any designation can get, and then
It's
you
just the same
enhance it, and
information.
then it's exempt. For any of the designations, or is that not right?
I don't know if it's all of them, but it's a lot more, yes.
Your language doesn't include neighborhood development area, but you have downtown, village center, Newtown center, growth center.
Yeah.
Here they are. You just need to move that slider over.
And the joint proposal is just downtowns and neighborhood development areas.
Can I ask Billy a question too?
Yeah.
Was that a negotiation, just to have only the 2 instead of the full list of areas?
It was actually an area that we both agreed. I think, ACCD acknowledged that really the goal is to focus growth in the tighter areas around downtowns and provide smaller communities through the neighborhood development area designation the opportunity to get that benefit as well. And some of the other designations like growth centers and new town centers are a lot bigger, they're less built out, and that probably the full amount of permitting would be appropriate there. So it was certainly the NRC's desire to keep it tight, and I think we agreed that if it was going to just a full exemption, that it made sense to do it in these locations. So.
David Mendola.
So if I'm up in Averill, which doesn't have zoning, I wanna put up a store, I'm thinking about putting up a little mom and pop store, and I get my Act 250 permit, but then I decide it's not gonna work, I don't wanna do it, I wanna sell the land. Does that land now under this, what we're talking about in terms of taking, since that project is not going forward, does the permit or the 250 permit still live with that land, even though the project that it was intended to support or allow to go forward never was built?
So we're gonna talk about that tomorrow. That's the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
That it's not in this,
Okay,
but we will.
as long as we're gonna talk about it, it's all right.
We wanna do,
There's a specific statutory provision that a land use permit which is not used expires due to non-use, I think after 2 or 3 years, if you don't use it. If you don't put a shovel in the ground, the permit
Well,
expires.
I would say that, that's not been my experience with Act 250. So I don't know, are you talking about other permits or Act 250?
Act 250, there's a specific statute and a rule. It doesn't happen automatically. You file something with the commission, and they used to do this pro forma. If the ground was never disturbed, the permit never used, the commission would issue an order in a week or so and say, permit expired due to non-use, lifting jurisdiction.
Are you gonna be here tomorrow?
No, on trial care duty.
All right, well, we're gonna take that up tomorrow, and I'm interested in it, but I think we should focus on this today for our conversation. Representative Dolan, did you have?
Yeah, if we're gonna come back, I can call.
If we're gonna come back to jurisdiction, release from jurisdiction is a separate issue, we'll come back to tomorrow, but we're talking about the downtowns right now.
Okay.
And these, I think, just trying to decide if we wanna go forward with, which one of these we wanna go forward with, or maybe not at all, I don't know.
So can I make up?
Yes.
I'm looking at the definitions of, what would be probably applicable to my rural district is the neighborhood development area. And so I'm reading it's helpful to read the definitions, because it does talk about they need to exclude the flood hazard and fluvial erosion areas, they need to minimize impact of important natural resources, et cetera. So that was helpful for me to see that in addition to what Mr. Coster had talked about in terms of bringing the necessary criteria over, should the current bylaws are not similar. There's also inherent in the definition some important goals that we would, such as making sure we're not building in harm's way. So I thought that was helpful. When I look at the overall picture of what we're trying to accomplish with these modernizations, what we've been talking about for the last year, I see that this provision on the joint proposal contains the protections we're seeking, and is an important balance when we're looking at the balance includes protections on forest blocks, connected habitat, ridgelines. And so with that in mind, and knowing that we can pull those important insurances of having the important criteria in place as part of that the exemption, I support the joint proposal.
I don't disagree with you. I think, I'd like to understand, the standard by which the zoning bylaws are reviewed, when these designations are granted. And if there are requirements that, for what's in those bylaws.
So, if this is something you're willing, I think there's a lot of really good questions about this section. It's pretty core to the proposal. It's fairly complicated. I cannot answer these questions well, so if you're interested, we could certainly get ACCD, and the attorneys that worked on this here tomorrow, ideally, to kind of walk you through all this and answer all those questions, because I'm just not.
We are definitely interested in that.
Yeah, I'm just not the man to do all that. So.
Fair enough, and we're better in the morning anyway, so, that's a great offer, we'll take you up on
Okay, I'll try to arrange that.
it. Thank you.
Can I ask one question of Mr. Coster?
Yes,
When I'm reading about the planned development area, I know that it's specific about housing, and obviously having water, wastewater, and stuff like that, but, so if you were, though, in a community with zoning, that is interested in this, but their project might be more, renovation of a Grange to be multi-use, for example. I don't know to what extent it would trigger Act 250, generally, because you're in a town with zoning, and therefore you have the 10-acre, threshold conditions, but I'm just trying to think, are there, in your mind, in your experience, have you ever run across examples where a project that is worthy to do, but is more commercial in its proposal as opposed to be housing? That I guess my question is, why did that neighborhood development area solely look at housing as opposed to something more broader that would include commercial?
So this would be another good question for Chris, but my understanding is that the neighborhood development area category was really intended to make it easier to build housing near our growth centers, because there's such pressure on affordable housing and things of that nature. Commercial and other sorts of development within those areas, once they're designated, would still enjoy all these benefits, but the main kind of purpose of the NDA program initially was to promote housing near our downtowns. So I think Chris and others have testified to you that, if this proposal went ahead and exemptions existed in neighborhood development areas, other forms of development would benefit, not just residential, but that's the intent behind the NDA class of designations.
So the NDA doesn't prohibit commercial development?
No.
Right, okay, so I'm hearing a high level of interest in the joint proposal on this one. There's some other things in ours, like the elevation thing is actually coming up in this section. So it's probably worth looking at, if we were going to go to the joint proposal for this part of the enhanced designation, to replace the enhanced designation piece in ours, there's still some things I'd like to walk us through that are different, applying to different things. So on page 26, for example, the elevation comes up. That's the one that I'm seeing right now, but I think there could be others.
Okay, so yeah, yours, you have under the definition of development, which are the jurisdictional triggers, construction of improvements, under little 3I, construction of improvements for commercial or industrial purposes on a tract or tracts of land owned or controlled by a person involving more than 1 acre of land within a rural and working lands area. And I didn't include that definition, but in your bill, rural and working lands area means an area that is not an existing settlement or a critical resource area.
Clear.
Which potentially is a lot of things. And then construction of improvements for commercial, industrial, or residential use at or above the elevation of 2,000 feet or in a critical resource area below that elevation.
Can I ask a question about the previous paragraph?
Yep.
The part that has been struck?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
We moved it. It still exists. So it's in your bill. It's we have the initial sort of jurisdictional thresholds, which are 10 acres if you have permanent zoning and bylaws, 1 acre if you don't have permanent zoning and bylaws, or the part that's struck here, if the municipality has adopted permanent zoning bylaws, they can still elect to be a 1 acre town.
oh, and.
And that is, so
that's-
we moved that up to be with the other section, yeah, so it exists still.
Okay, I look forward to seeing the whole bill again.
Why would someone like to do that?
Some people want the review of Act 250.
Yeah. I think
don't know.
Waterbury,
Well, Waterbury's done, I was gonna say, some people want it, but who? Who's done that? So, this changes the jurisdictional elevation as a separate from the downtown, so, do you wanna have that conversation now? As,
I'd rather have that conversation tomorrow.
Yeah.
okay,
I do.
I'm hearing we're done. We will adjourn for the day.
I have a UVM, I'm gonna miss tomorrow, but I have it tonight.
Would that be, at the mean high water level of Lake Champlain in the last 5 years?
Party on it.